No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship to the Father, has made him known. And that's the key there, that Christ has made God known to us. Right? That's the essence of the Christian faith. To me, that automatically excludes any notions of presumptive arrogance on my part, that I have somehow attained to a knowledge because I'm clever or I figured something out or whatever. No, it's all because God has revealed himself to us by his grace. And it's only an act of his grace.
Okay, welcome to another Prepared to Answer podcast. My name is Shawn Walker, and as always, I'm joined by Scott.
Hello.
How are you today, Scott?
Good.
Good. We are continuing on our deconstruction series, and the question for today is it wrong to think I'm right? And this is a problem because I think I'm always right.
I know you do, and that is a problem, Shawn. I'm glad we set aside time to talk about this because I've been wanting to bring it up with you for a while.
Excellent. So now everyone can go through this. Let's call it a therapy session.
This is an intervention.
Exactly. But I understand we're starting off this episode with a clip. Is that right?
Yeah, we are. Of course, is it wrong to think I'm right? Our interest is in this whole discussion around faith, right? Faith belief, Shawn. And yeah, I thought what would be interesting is for me, I wanted to share with our listeners a clip from a talk that I had the privilege to sit under. It was in 2018. Probably a lot of people don't realize this, but in 2018, Toronto, Ontario, hosted the Parliament of World Religions Conference, which was quite a big deal. But I got word of this, and so I decided, you know what, I'd like to attend and see, be a part of the experience. So I went. It was a kind of a 4-day thing, and I went. And one of the speakers that I heard was a man by the name of Rabbi David Rosen, who was a very well-regarded leader in the Jewish community, has been a part of interfaith dialogue and understanding kinds of movement for quite a while. Anyway, he gave a talk, and I want to play just a clip from that talk. It sets up, I think, the discussion we're going to have around this whole idea of thinking we're right about what we believe in terms of our own faith commitments. So here, I'm going to play it, and then we'll leap off from there.
It had never occurred to me before to even think about the meaning of other religions. I grew up, like many people, within traditional homes, especially an Orthodox home, but I thought of my religion as the way, and others in relative degrees of light or darkness. And as I encountered these wonderful people from different religious traditions, the obvious question confronted me, that if God has created us in all our diversity and relates to us in so many diverse ways, there must be diverse ways of relating to him. And that, in fact, if we affirm, especially within the Judeo-Christian and Muslim traditions, that the human being is created with a special character that we refer to as the divine image or with a divine spark, even as the regent of God in the world. If God is to be found everywhere, but above all, that unique presence in the human person, then every human encounter is in fact an encounter with the divine. And how much more so when you encounter the other in the sense of the divine in her or his life. God is more than any one religion. The very idea that one tradition can encapsulate that totality should be for us ludicrous.
It was interesting to be sitting in the room at that time, a couple thousand delegates from, 100 and some religions of the world. And I'm thinking, I think I'm the only ludicrous person in the room.
Were you one cheering? Were you one of those that were cheering?
I probably was the only one who wasn't cheering and desperately hoping no one would ask me why. But I mean, you can appreciate though the kind of the spirit in the room, and you can appreciate, I guess you can appreciate how passionate he is about the subject. Mm-hmm. But it just, I guess, to start the discussion and just clearly this is a very popular idea.
Sure. Well, you could hear from the cheering, right? And I could imagine sitting there amongst all these delegates, that feeling of probably like oneness, right? That we're all together on this. And so when someone stands up and says this, well, of course, right? How can we be at odds? We love each other.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, I felt very out of place.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, what a wet blanket I am. If people really knew what I thought, I mean, they'd all be like, wow.
Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And we can even look to history, right, to see that wars have been fought over religion.
Sure.
And so I'm sure speeches like this really, they speak to people's desire to be peaceful and harmonious.
Yeah, you know what? I think they paint a picture of the world, or I think they create a sense of optimism about the future that, if we can just get past these, what I think would be seen in terms of, in the sphere of religion, these superficial differences that divide us, then we can discover and celebrate and be unified around the things that really unite us. And there's an appeal to that because on paper, it looks like it'll just solve all our problems. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's probably a big part of the appeal. I think another part of it, though, Shawn, is that, it's just really become ingrained in our culture. Our culture is a culture of religious pluralism. And I think it's worth just kind of clarifying and understanding that there's a distinction here between what I would call descriptive religious pluralism versus prescriptive religious pluralism. Descriptive religious pluralism simply says that there are many different faith traditions, many of which make helpful and positive contributions to our world. And I think that's a statement that I can get on board with. Sure. For sure. There are lots of different faith traditions. And again, many of them do bring very positive contributions to humanity as a whole, to the world. Prescriptive religious pluralism, though, is a little bit different in that it agrees with descriptive religious pluralism, but then it goes on to say that of all these different religious faith traditions, no one can say that any one faith tradition is uniquely capable of saving or liberating us. That all religions can do that, ultimately.
Right. So where would truth show up then between these two types of pluralism?
Well, I think truth, if we're talking about religious truth, I think in prescriptive religious pluralism, that's where they're really kind of trying to nail down the truth component. Okay. Where, historically, or maybe as a caricature, religions that would say, no, we hold to the truth. Right. And Rosen kind of described his upbringing, right? How he saw in their tradition, they had the truth and everyone else, to varying degrees had lesser exposure to the truth. They were in darkness, so to speak. And I think that's where prescriptive religious pluralism comes in to say that, no, you can't say that. No one can really say that. Okay. That any one religious tradition has an exclusive claim to the truth.
Right. So that would be representative of what Rosen is saying.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. And that's, but like you said, as a Christian sitting in that audience, that made you uncomfortable.
Yeah. Right. And I think that is, in terms of our discussion today, I think that's what we're trying to get at as far as one of the challenges that I think Christians who are going through maybe deconstruction processes or deconstruction experiences are facing is there's a real palpable feeling of discomfort of how out of step, right? Yeah. With the sentiments and values of our culture, especially around religious truth and religious belief, Christians are.
Right.
That is traditional Bible-believing, gospel-proclaiming Christians. We are so out of step, and it makes us uncomfortable. I mean, you can't help but feel self-conscious sitting in that room. There was a meet and greet time earlier, and I was drinking coffee and making conversation, desperately hoping no one would ask a lot of real questions about who I was or what I did or what I believed, because I knew I was a fish out of water in that environment. Because we as Christians, we are followers of Jesus, who in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
So within that session, you felt self-conscious.
Yeah. So you can appreciate why people feel uncomfortable. Right. People, if we're wrestling with our faith and the claims of Christianity, there is a real opposition in terms of just our cultural mindset that Christians have to overcome.
Right.
And I don't want to say it's easy.
No.
There's a real challenge to it. So I think what I want to talk about together, Shawn, is just given that's the reality of our cultural landscape. Mm-hmm. This is the environment in which we're trying to struggle through or work through growing in our faith. Mm-hmm. And for people who are struggling in their faith, mm-hmm. they likely feel the reality of our prescriptively, religiously pluralistic society, right? What do we do?
Right.
And so today, I mean, we're not going to be able to solve this all, but I think today, at least I want to touch on what I hope are maybe some helpful insights to consider as you continue to work through whatever process of wrestling through doubts or uncertainties mm-hmm. in your own faith walk. Yeah, that's my modest goal for our time together here.
Okay. So where do we start?
Well, I'd start here. For Christians who are wrestling with faith doubts, and perhaps part of that being the discomfort we just described here, of trying to uphold an exclusive claim mm-hmm. like Jesus made, that Jesus is the only way, in a culture that says that nobody can say that. Right? Here are some helpful things I think that are worth considering. The first is, Shawn, to try and identify exactly what the source of that discomfort is. Again, I felt uncomfortable.
Right.
So what was the discomfort I was feeling? And I knew it was discomfort because I'm a Christian, right?
Yes.
And it wasn't just I wasn't afraid of anything really. I mean, it was not an intimidating environment. The people there were all very gracious and kind, and that was just fine. I think what is helpful though has helped me is a distinction that Paul Copan made in his book, True for You, but Not for Me. He writes is a great resource, and we'll have it in the resource list on this episode in terms of dealing with this whole subject of religious pluralism. Paul Copan quoted a former professor who said, "I don't think I'm always right, but I do always think I'm right."
That sounds like the same thing, Scott.
Does that clear it up for you?
Oh, yeah. Well, and we want to thank you for joining us on the
Tune in next time for more riddles. Yeah. So, I read that. I'm like, what? That sounds like the same thing. And then I read it more carefully and, of course, put it in the context that Copan was sharing it in. And there is a difference.
Okay.
To say that I think I'm always right, really, that's more of an attitude or a posture that I take, which really presents itself as arrogance. I think it breeds pride.
Okay.
To say that, you know what, I think I am always right.
Okay.
The emphasis there is on me.
Okay. Is there an example? Can we go through an example, a position that you might take on something?
No, it's not. There's not so much an example, but it's the kind of person you are. You know the kind of person.
Right.
You know what? They always think they're right.
Right.
They'll never concede to being wrong.
Yes.
Even when they are, right? They'll try and argue their position, even if it becomes ludicrous, and realize, you're so off.
Yes.
You're so off board. But that's more of a posture or an attitude of infallibility or unquestionability. I can't be questioned because I always know what's right.
Right. So where would you see that? Would you see that in a person that when shown that they're wrong about a situation, like kind of go to the mat to defend their position?
I think where this shows up, and I mean, how do you know what a person thinks?
Yeah.
But exactly. I think that it shows up when people get defensive or even hostile if you question them.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Right.
Like even right off the bat.
Right.
So now I'm thinking of myself.
Well, yeah. Again, Shawn, this is all about you and pointing out that you often get defensive.
Yes. Okay.
No. You see people, this comes out in how people react when you challenge their position.
Okay.
And the more you challenge and perhaps even the more you demonstrate that their position is wrong,
yes,
they become even more hostile.
Okay.
Where it's perhaps the most extreme example is then when people who are arguing for their position start name calling.
Okay.
Right? As soon as name calling begins, you have run out of arguments to defend your position. You no longer have a reason. You're not giving you reasons anymore for why you believe you're right.
Right.
It's more of a posture of the kind of person you are or become, because people who think or act like they're always right, they tend to get defensive.
Right.
Because for them, the priority is not believing what's right, but being right.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
So
that goes back to the pride. You're talking about pride.
That's a pride thing. Yeah. Right. That's a character thing. Right. And so that's what Copen's professor meant by saying, I don't always think I'm right.
Right.
But then he goes on to say, but I do always think I'm right. Okay. And that is really about conviction.
Okay.
Of knowing something is true or knowing you're right. And the reality is we couldn't live if we didn't think that way. Like if we didn't ever think we were right, we'd become absolutely paralyzed. If you looked out in the traffic and we're going to make a left turn and if you didn't think that there were no cars coming or it was safe, you would stop moving.
Right.
You'd never execute your decision. So, I mean, imagine what the world would look like if no one was ever convinced that they were right.
Yeah.
And even when it comes to religious belief, if people didn't believe that their religious beliefs were right, why would they believe them at all?
Right.
Then you're believing for no reason, I guess.
Right. So if we go back, though, to the position of being challenged, so this person that thinks that they're right, though doesn't take that posture of thinking that they're always right and they're challenged to what they believe.
Yeah. I think probably at the root of it all, Shawn, is simply humility.
Okay.
And I think the caricature that's often put forward, the critique, I would say sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, is that to hold the Christian belief that Jesus is the only way, well, the only kind of person who does that is the kind of person who always thinks they're right. And I don't think that necessarily has to be true.
Okay.
But I think sometimes Christians struggle because they feel like, if I hold on to this faith, I'm this kind of person, right? I'm one of those people who always thinks they're right. And I don't think that's the case.
No.
I think we can think we're right and still be humble.
Sure.
And open to people questioning. And you know what? You could say, I don't think you're right at all.
Yeah.
Okay.
And not go to name calling.
Not go to name calling or being hostile, just really trying to even open up a conversation. But I think that's a useful distinction anyway, to try and get away from the caricature that Christians are narrow-minded, hostile, always have to be seen as right kind of people. I don't think that's true.
Yeah. Now, that caricature might have come from, or possibly did come from, churches, Christians that did act that way. Would that be true?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough, Shawn.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm sure some of our listeners might be saying, oh, yeah? Well, that was my experience. I mean, the leaders of our church, you could not question them. And if you did, you were hauled in.
Right.
And if that's the case, that's unfortunate.
Sure.
That's not the kind of leadership that Jesus provided, that's for sure.
No. And again, we're trying to, as we've said many times before, that the path to recovering your faith is recovering the faith. And so the faith that we're talking about is not one that browbeats. It's open to questions. Like you said, Jesus' leadership in Scripture shows that opening to questions, right? And not that character that we see.
Yeah.
So now you had mentioned before when we were talking about that example that sometimes when we say or we feel that, we believe that Christ is the one that saves and the only way to truth, that others will then come and say, well, that's intolerant. You can't believe that. That's not inclusive.
Yeah.
Doesn't that lend itself to a truth claim in and of itself?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point, Shawn. I think that leads nicely to what I think is the next consideration that our listeners should have in mind if they're feeling that discomfort about, as Christians, how can we be the ones to say we have the truth, right? When our world wants to say, there's lots of paths and you can't say any one is particularly truer than another. I think is to realize that prescriptive religious pluralism, right? That idea that says you can't say one way is the only way, that denies the legitimacy of exclusive religious claims like Christianity, does so. Yeah. It denies that by making equally exclusive religious claims. And you can't get around that.
Right.
A great example that I've pointed to in the past is John Hick is a philosopher of religion, came out of a Christian background, still would espouse sort of a Christianized philosophy, but much more pluralistic in his outlook. And, as he was thinking through the philosophy of religion and what religions all seem to point to, he ultimately said, you know what, all religions are looking for some notion of the divine. We would say God. He coined it as the real. He said, I'm going to take the word God away because I'm going to use the real because it's not saddled with all kinds of history and religious baggage. But here's something he said. He said, religions as human attempts to grasp the real. So that's what he defines religion as. What religion is a human attempt to grasp the real, or God, cannot grasp the real as it really is. What he wants to say, what Hick wants to say is that, look, whatever the divine is, the ultimate real, like God, if we want to say, whatever he is it is so infinitely beyond what we are, right? We are finite, physical, time-bound, earth-bound creatures, right? The base of reality, whatever holds it all together, is so far beyond us that no one, like Rosen said, right? No one can ultimately say that their faith or their belief has grasped a hold of that. There's a couple implications from what Hick is saying here. The first is that, in essence, Hick is saying that religions claiming to know the truth path to God and salvation are wrong.
And he knows us how?
Because he's claiming that what he has just said is true, right? His view of the real, which is that it's unknowable, is true. And therefore, the religious claims that say that they know the real are false, right? Which is itself an exclusivist claim.
Yeah.
He's now excluded other religious truth claims. Okay, here's another example from a book that I found really interesting. The title of the book is called American Veda by Philip Goldberg. It's a really interesting book. I won't get into it, but Philip Goldberg he's Jewish in his background, but he would be I would call him a mystic Jew. He is also exploring this whole idea of, all faiths ultimately pointing to the same thing. Here's something he says. He says that all religions are not the same could not be more obvious. Because obviously, religions are not the same. He says the coherence, though, that they point to, in other words, the similarity or the unity they point to, is in the realm of inner experience. He says where the individual soul meets the all-encompassing divine, or maybe what Hick would have referred to as the real.
Sure.
He says, in other words, while religious customs, rituals, and dogmas, that's teachings, vary, all traditions, if taken deep enough, can bring back practitioners to essentially the same place, our silent origin or essence, which transcends all notion of place, all words, all concepts, all theologies. He says, once again, truth is one. The wise call it by many names. So in essence, what he's saying is, ultimately, regardless of the surface differences in religions, even their contradictory teachings that one teach, what they're teaching are mutually exclusive about God or whatever. He said, ultimately, that doesn't matter because what they're really pointing to is something beyond even thought itself. It's pointing to the unity of our being with the unity of, the divine, or the silent origin of our beginnings, which is really whatever the real is that Hicks refers to. This sounds very open and inviting.
Sure it does. Yeah.
And non-dogmatic.
No.
So what he would say is, listen, as a Christian, I say that Jesus is the only way. And he would say, that's fine. That's fine for you. And I would say, okay, so then how does that not create a problem? Well, the reason it doesn't create a problem is because the real truth is that what your statement is saying is really just a reflection of something even deeper.
That you can't grasp.
That you can't even grasp with those words.
But he can?
Exactly.
Okay.
In order to support a religious view that can accommodate all religious beliefs, what is it that he needs to claim? That he knows the truth about the truth, right?
Yeah.
And because he's making a claim about truth, it necessarily excludes any claim that doesn't agree with it.
That's So we're right back to square one.
Yeah, it's unavoidable,
Sure,
Shawn.
yes.
Even a statement that denies our ability to know the truth
Right.
is a statement claiming to know truth. So although religious pluralistic kinds of sentiments sound inclusive, at the end of the day, they are just as exclusive, right?
Right.
They've just changed the criteria for what gets excluded.
Sure. And if you mine deep enough in it, and even back to that quote from Philip Goldberg, you can even say, he talks about our silent origin.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Right. He's making a statement about what is ultimately real,
Right.
ultimately true about our origin in the universe.
Exactly.
It's a religious statement.
Sure it is.
Yeah. He's making a truth claim.
Right. Yeah.
Of course he is. So something that's worth keeping in mind as well. The last thing I just want to tease out a bit, Shawn, is realizing that pursuing certainty in what you believe is not a sign of arrogance. I mean, it can be.
Sure.
Claiming certainty, again, we talked about that posture. It can be become an arrogance, a pride.
Right. Yeah.
But it does so by really shifting the credit for obtaining religious knowledge to the individual.
Right.
I figured this out.
It goes really back to what you were talking about in pride. If seeking knowledge and truth is to bolster my image, my ability to speak above others, then that's a pride issue.
We might get into this in our next episode, Shawn.
Okay.
Because I really think, yes, I think that's true. And I really think it has to do with seeing or crediting the wrong source for how it is we know what's true.
Yes.
But anyway, I think it's just worth pointing out that pursuing certainty in what you believe is not a sign of arrogance. It's actually a responsibility, right? And here's something Michael Kruger says in his book. One of the books we've recommended in our last newsletter was The 10 Commandments of Progressive Christianity, which is a bit of an exploration into what we've been broadly touching on through this series of looking at some of the tenets of progressive Christian belief. Here's what Kruger says. He says, to say I don't know, which sounds like a very humble thing to say.
Sure.
To say I don't know is only the right answer if, in fact, there is no, what he says, epistemological basis, which is just a basis of knowing.
Right.
If there is no way of knowing, by which a person could know something. But what if a person does, in fact, have a basis for knowing? If she does, then saying I don't know would be irresponsible. Right?
Right.
If you actually know something is true and then claim you don't, that's actually deception.
Sure it is.
Yeah.
Well, the example that Kruger uses in his book is that someone were to ask you, did Abraham Lincoln sign the Proclamation or the Emancipation Proclamation? And
as a Canadian, I would say, I don't know.
That's right. Yes. So Michael Kruger is an American, as you could tell by this example. But what he was saying in the book was essentially, if you say, I don't know, just to be humble when, in fact, everyone does know because the signature is there on it.
Right.
That's not responsible.
Yeah, no, that's a good illustration.
Sure.
So what Kruger is saying is that claiming to know something is the responsible thing to do if, in fact, you have a justifiable basis for knowing it.
Okay.
Like if you can say, I really do know this, then it's responsible to say, I really do know this.
Right.
Okay. One of the problems we face today, though, is that we're living in the middle of a battle about knowing.
About truth.
Ultimately about truth, about knowing truth.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to religious belief.
Sure.
And very much see this battle going on even within the church. I would say the two extremes in this battle are represented by the modern versus postmodern view of knowledge. Yeah. Our Western past, in terms of Western culture and Western thinking, was a very modern, or came out of a very modern view of knowledge.
Which would be what?
Which argued that reason, in particular, man by reason, can obtain a certain knowledge.
Okay.
Not in particular, but certain knowledge about objective universal truths. And very closely tied in there was the whole realm of the scientific enterprise.
Sure.
So reason and science could give us real, objective, universal truths about the world.
Right. So what would be an example?
That the boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius, right?
Yes.
These are discoverable truths. And of course, science has shown us that.
Sure.
Science and reason have, the modern knowledge enterprise has given us a broad body of very useful, real knowledge.
Right.
And we've seen how it's benefited society and benefited culture through history. But it's also bred a posture of arrogance among those who would then present what they claim to know as beyond doubt. Okay. And that's some of the critique that's coming out of the postmodern reaction, is that, yes, these things gave us many, many useful pieces of knowledge, but it then also bred this posture of arrogance, particularly in the West, that somehow we had the corner of truth, on knowing truth about the world, and therefore the way things should be.
So, but this spanned everything, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And then that's a much bigger discussion.
Sure.
We won't get into that.
But that did seep into the church?
Right. But we can appreciate then how such an approach to knowledge then crept into religious knowledge. And the result being that it produced an equally arrogant and even oppressive faith environment. And again, Kruger talks about, he says in the kinds of contexts, church contexts, that such, beliefs about knowledge produced, he said faith questions generally are discouraged then. And should they arise, the expectation is that you will accept the answer you've been given, and as a result, serious intellectual engagement is not an option. And I think that is what a lot of Christians who are struggling through kind of these maybe deconstruction doubts or processes maybe have come out of that kind of an environment. Where, don't think, you're not encouraged to really think independently. Repeat the dogma.
Yes.
Just repeat what you've been told. Don't question.
Yeah.
And then everything will be fine.
Don't step out of line.
Right. And I don't think that is a healthy version of faith commitment, a Christian faith commitment.
Right. Again, when we're going back to recovering the faith wouldn't endorse that type of questioning.
Well, no. You're told not to question. You're just told what to believe.
Right.
So there's no independent thinking encouraged.
Right.
The alternative isn't just to say, okay, anybody can question what they want to question. The alternative is saying, okay, if you have questions, ask the questions.
Right.
And we'll discuss them.
Okay.
Because we're not afraid of questions in Christianity because God's given us good answers.
Right.
Right. We don't have to hide behind some kind of a shield of impenetrable spiritual authority for fear that someone will ask a question that'll make the whole thing come tumbling down. Usurp the leadership of the church somehow. It's possible in some churches.
Sure.
Leaders need to be questioned.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the ultimate authority isn't the leaders, it's the scriptures.
Sure.
And so if you have a leadership that is saying, don't question us, there's a very real possibility they've stepped away from scripture. And so the church needs to hold their leaders accountable to holding to scripture. And I think in order for that to happen, there has to be an openness, a willingness for open dialogue about the things that we claim and hold to be true. So that's the concern, many have voiced about the impact of this modern view of knowledge that it's had on Christianity. It's created this aura of unquestionable certainty, which closes down intellectual thought, which closes down real thinking. The alternative, though, is a very...
Yeah, what's the other extreme?
Well, the other extreme is a very, it's not really an improvement. It's a very postmodern view, which postmodernism is simply a reaction to modernism. A postmodern view of knowledge, which wants to argue that there is no way to know things objectively. In other words, that the truth about them as they really are, because no one can escape their own finite or contextualized perspectives, right? Like we all live within a context. We all live within a context of time and culture and language and custom. And we can't get out of that. We can't get out of our own perspectives. And as a result, then, no one can ever claim to know things as they truly are. They can only claim to know them as they interpret them, as they experience them, and as they interpret those experiences. And a very progressive Christian position to take on this means we must also include God in that. Right? So while the modern view is often portrayed as being arrogant and oppressive, the postmodern view, in fact, they both are, right? By the power of our reason, the modern view wants to say, by the power of our reason, we've gained certain knowledge about God, right? We can have knowledge with certainty about God, unquestionable. The postmodern reaction is, no, because you're finite, you cannot obtain a true knowledge of God, but only your own interpretation of God.
Yeah, both seem very extreme.
Both are extreme views about what we can know.
Right.
Both are claims to have certainty about the things that we can know, one certain that we can know truth, and one certain that we can't. But both can be used to deny our ability and responsibility to know truths about God that we really can know. So maybe I just kind of summarize this way to say, as you're moving through perhaps a kind of a faith reconstruction process, beware of seemingly open-minded suggestions that claiming to actually know the truth about God is a sign of arrogance. Modernism, certainty about knowledge.
Yeah.
Because more often than not, denials of our ability to know truth are really just an alternative version of knowledge certainty being smuggled in the back door.
As we looked at those quotes
previously,
they seem to be truth claims.
Right.
With certainty.
Yeah.
That is ludicrous to believe that. Right?
Well, yes.
So where does this leave us?
Well, I think, just a few things I'd want to close with, Shawn, just to kind of summarize, I guess. Where we began is asking the question, is it wrong to believe I'm right? Which really came out of, again, listening to the quote at the beginning, the sense of self-consciousness that we can have, that we're almost conditioned to have in our culture, about even suggesting the notion that our faith beliefs are the right way, the way. And of course, as Christians, we cannot escape the very clear language of Jesus, who points to himself and says, I am the way. One of the things we wanted to help was just maybe first of all, in making the distinction between thinking you're always right and always thinking you're right. No, we don't want to be the kind of people who always think we're right. Right. That is a posture issue. That's a character issue. We don't want to be those kind of people. But to hold our beliefs and to believe that what Christ teaches us is right, there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
Right. Everybody does that all the time. People always tend to believe they're right. The second thing, and this is kind of what we covered as well, Shawn, was that just remembering that these seemingly inclusive, pluralistic religious beliefs, the idea that all ways lead to the same destination, are simply another form of exclusive religious belief claims. They are to say always lead to the same destination is making an ultimate religious belief claim about the ultimate nature of truth. Okay, it's inescapable.
Sure.
It's just changing the criteria of what's excluded. And then the last thing I think, Shawn, is just to realize that, and this is kind of going to point to what we want to talk about next time, is as Christians realizing that our knowledge of God is not ultimately dependent on us anyway. We talked about those two, the poles in our knowledge debate in our culture between the modern and postmodern views of knowledge. Both are extremes, but both share the same, I think, ultimate flaw when it comes to our understanding of God. It's the assumption that our understanding of God begins with us. And what we can know. Assumptions that we somehow have the power to obtain knowledge about God ourselves, or that we have no way of knowing anything about God because of our finiteness. And
it all points to us.
Right. Both ignore the very core essence of Christian faith, which is this, namely, that God has revealed himself to us. It's God that's made himself known. And if God can make himself known, then he must be knowable. And that certainly we could never exhaustively or meticulously know everything about God, that we can really know him as he truly is through the person of Jesus, who is the incarnate Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. Right? We worship a triune God. And I'll just quote John in John's Gospel, the first chapter, right? We could park on this a lot, but maybe we'll get into this more next time. But here's what John says. He says the Word, and he identifies the Word. The Word, this euphemism he's given, he's referring to Jesus. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And down in verse 18, he goes on to say, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship to the Father, has made him known. And that's the key there, that Christ has made God known to us, right? That's the essence of the Christian faith. To me, that automatically excludes any notions of presumptive arrogance on my part, that I have somehow attained to a knowledge because I'm clever or I figured something out or whatever. No, it's all because God has revealed himself to us by his grace. And it's only an act of his grace.
Yeah. Wow. You know what, Scott? I think that's a great place to end this episode. And I can tell you I'm looking forward to the next one. And until then, God bless.
This podcast has been a ministry of Prepared to Answer. Our mission at Prepared to Answer is to help prepare, equip, and encourage the Church of Jesus Christ to grow in confidence of faith by teaching Christians to think like Jesus. To access more resources to help you begin understanding life and the world around you with the mind of Jesus, visit our website at www.preparedtoanswer.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Prepared to Answer. Or contact us directly by email at info@preparedtoanswer.org. May the Lord bless and keep you.